Hi Charm Scouts and welcome to Camp Gertie. I hope you're so excited about our new theme for this year. It's been really hard not to spill the beans about what we're doing because I just knew that you all were going to love it. So many ideas for what we can do for Camp Gertie and this camping theme and more Charm Scouts uniforms over the year. But for our very first Charm Scout themed project, we decided to do a little capelet. Melisha and I both watched the movie Troop Beverly Hills. I rewatched it. It was one of my favorite childhood movies. Watched it around this time and we were loving Shelley Long in her dramatic capelet. So we've been thinking about doing a capelet for Patreon for quite a while. Thought it would go really well with the Stanwyck dress, which was one of our expansions here on Patreon. So this idea to make the capelet Charm Scout themed was born. So we're going with a really fun color scheme in blush and this pine green. The overall shape of the capelet is pretty simple. It has just a sort of straight front and back and then a sort of dramatic flutter sleeve on the capelet. Collar, epaulets, which are optional. So if you want to make a non-scouting version of the capelet, you can just take the epaulets off. And then line it, of course, in a pop of color, always nice, and then just simple facing. So there are only 10 pattern pieces, which I think is pretty minimal for a pattern like this, and it comes together relatively quickly. I do want to show you some things today, like how to do the piping on the epaulets and the collar. And I'm going to give you some tips as well for working with, in a color scheme like this where the outer fabric is a lot lighter than the lining. So ways to prevent show through of the lining color. I also wanted to mention that this pattern is completely interchangeable with the hooded princess coat pattern, which was the very first expansion we ever did on Patreon in 2020. So the hood can be used on the capelet. And then the neckline of the capelet also works with that princess coat expansion. So there's lots of options for what you can do here. You'll see pictures of the fur-lined hooded capelet that I made, which turned out really beautiful, very Belle from Beauty and the Beast. But you could also do a little removable capelet that goes with a princess coat. And I didn't have time to do it for this round, but I want one of you to do it. Okay, so I think that's everything. We're going to talk first about supplies and fabrics and how to get started with sewing. So let's go on over to the table. Okay, everyone, let's talk fabric and supplies. So you can see I've got some things laid out here. I want to first talk about my outer fabric. I ended up using a really lovely double wool crepe, which is a really nice fabric, has a nice texture to it. It's 100% wool, the one I used. You can really use any suiting fabric for the capelet. I would just say look for something with a nice drape. Now, I did want to talk about underlining your capelet because, as I mentioned in the intro, if you use something like this lovely charmeuse that I used for the lining that is a much darker, richer color than your outer fabric, then what can happen is that you can get some show through of the lining through to the outer fabric. And a way to prevent that is to underline each outer piece in a nice opaque white cotton that has a similar drape to the suiting or outer fabric that you're using. So I found some really soft, very drapey 100% cotton batiste in a bright white color, which just provides another layer of opacity to the outer fabric pieces. So you can see I basted that around the outer edges, just cut the same fabric pieces for the outer and for the underlining, basted them together at 1/2 inch. And I did that for the front pieces, the back, and the sleeves. And that's going to help tremendously with any show through of that dark green. So that's your underlining technique if you want to use it.
And then let's talk a little bit about linings. This is a really fun opportunity to use something, a pop of color, a print, something like that. I was initially hoping to do polka dots, but it didn't pan out. So I'm just using this really lovely emerald silk charmeuse. So anything slippery with a nice drape to it will work well for a lining. And then some of the pieces need to be interfaced. So you can see this one of my collar pieces here. I used a weft fusible interfacing for this. And as I've mentioned before, I like to get a lot of my interfacings from Fashion Sewing Supply. So I'll give you a link to that as always. Okay, so then a few more things you're going to need to make the capelet. Buttons. So if you're doing the, it's one of Hattie's toys. If you're doing the epaulette version, you will need 3 buttons, okay? If you're not going to do the epaulettes, then you just need 1, and they should be 7/8 of an inch. And I found these really pretty emerald green ones to match the lining at M&J Trim in New York. And then I would also recommend having a snap to do the neckline closure, and then the button will just be decorative. Now you could do a bound buttonhole if you like, if you want to practice your bound buttonholes, or if you're feeling confident, you could go ahead and do a bound buttonhole. It is a little tricky to make a machine buttonhole on this capelet because there's a lot of bulk right around where the buttonhole goes. So it's just a lot simpler to do a snap with a decorative button on the outside, and that's what I'm going to be doing today. I found these covered buttons at M&J Trim, and they also have a color that's like an ivory color, which looks really nice with the blush. So hopefully those will turn up around my studio somewhere because that will go a little nicer. Or you can just use a metallic snap as well. Okay, piping. So for the Charm Scout capelets, obviously want to do some nice green piping around the collar and around the epaulets. Mr. Jingles. So I found this Wright's already made bias tape maxi piping, which I use quite a bit if you don't want to make your own. You can certainly make your own piping, but I found this color that was really perfect. It's called Jungle Green, and I give you a link to this in the instructions. Just 1 package of these will be fine for the capelet. If you're going to do the dress, you'll probably want an additional packet. So there is your piping. And I also want to talk a little bit about this beautiful Camp Gertie badge that we made. I have already applied mine. These are going to be for sale in the Patreon exclusive merch store on the Charm site. So you'll be able to buy these on that site, and I will let you know as soon as they come in. And I wanted to mention just adhering them. I will let you know that I had a little mishap with mine. The first ones we got had an iron-on backing, and I accidentally damaged my beautiful wool crepe with the heat of the iron. So I am 100% against anything iron-on at this point, and I've been looking into other options. Obviously, you can just do a nice straight stitch around the patch. But I also found this stuff, thanks to someone who is a Girl Scout troop leader, called Badge Magic. So if you guys are moms and you have scouts at home, you probably know about this already. And it's a non-iron adhesive. So it was really easy to use, comes with instructions. You don't have to iron anything, just peel and stick, and it secures it really, really nicely. So because we're going to be doing merit badges and other patches over the year, I would really recommend maybe picking up a package of that. I got mine on Amazon, super easy to use. All right, so you'll want to apply your patch if you're using one before we get to the lining part. All right, so let's get started with first steps. Your very first sewing step is going to be your shoulder seams. So you can see I've got my capelet back right here and then my 2 fronts. These are going to need to be placed right sides together at the shoulder seams. So you can see my white underlining here. And there's a notch for you to match here. So match those notches and then just pin along these shoulder seams. And you're going to go and sew these at 5/8 of an inch and then press the seams open. So we'll do that. Very easy first step. And then the next step we have to do is the epaulets if you're doing them, because they are inserted into this seam right here where the sleeve is sewn. So we have to construct those first. So the next thing we'll talk about is how to pipe your epaulets. Okay, we're ready to sew our shoulder seams. So you're going to be using a regular stitch length, so 2.5 millimeters is fine. And just making sure everything looks good here. And 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. You're gonna back stitch and just sew both of these seams as usual. So you can see now as I'm sewing how that white underlining is just going to get treated as one with the outer fabric. Second shoulder seam. Okay, now we're going to press these seams open. So use something like a seam roll or something like that to support your seam. And then just use a little steam here. Now, I'm sure I've warned you about this before, like with the swing coat and things like that, but with wool, you really don't want to press from the right side, ever, unless you're using a press cloth. So the inside is fine, but just, use a lot of caution when pressing wool because you can easily get shiny spots, and we don't want that. All right, let's do the other shoulder seam. Just press it open. Okay, and if you're not doing epaulets, you can go on ahead to the next step, which will be putting the sleeve in. But if we're doing epaulets, if you're doing epaulets, and I am, let's go over to the table and we'll talk about using piping. Okay, time to pipe our epaulets. So I will say, if you are going to do a version without piping, you're going to get a nice crisp corner on all of these little angles here when you sew the epaulets, and it's much easier when you don't have piping in there. Once you apply piping to these epaulets, you're going to get more of like a rounded shape around this sort of triangular point here, and it's okay. I would say I really tried my best when I was sewing it to try to get sharper angles, and once you're working with piping, it's just really not possible. So you're going to get a more slightly curved, rounded kind of shape when you have piping in there, and it still looks really nice, so don't worry about it. Okay, so here's your piping. I'm using this ready-made maxi piping, like I said, and you'll see that one side has sort of like, looks like the wrong side with like a chain stitch on it, and the other side has like a prettier stitch on it. So I'm going to be working with the wrong side up to start. Now you'll see for the epaulets we have two sets, right? So this is a pair and this is a pair, and you're going to pipe one side of each pair. And what you're going to do is apply the piping like this into the seam allowances. And what you want is for the cording to be within the body of the epaulet, so just past that 5/8 of an inch line. And for this part of the piping, which by the way is called the flange should be within that little strip of seam allowance. So I happen to know that the flange is 3/8 of an inch. So what you'll want is an additional 1/4 of an inch of pink showing past the flange, right? Because 3/8 of an inch on the flange plus 1/4 inch equals 5/8 of an inch for your seam allowance. So what I do as I'm sewing piping is I just kind of visually make sure that I've got 1/4 inch of fabric showing. And I'm pinning my piping in place just like this. And then at every corner, you're going to need to like pivot slightly. And it can help also to do a little snip into the flange right there. and at the point here, because then you won't get that weird little fold. So before I stitch, I'll do a little snip in there. So, and then just down this other side. Okay, so that's roughly it. When I go to stitch on the machine, I'm just going to really make sure to pivot at each of those corners as much as possible. Okay, so I'm going to cut the piping here and pipe another piece, pin the piping to another piece of epaulet, and then the other two don't need piping. Okay, so I'm going to keep pinning here, and then we'll go over to the machine and I'll talk about how to stitch your piping on.
Okay, so now that we've pinned our piping, we're ready to stitch it. So the first thing you want to do is put a zipper foot on your machine. I've put on this nice narrow one that I like on my Bernina, and then I moved the needle position all the way to the left so that when I stitch the piping, I'm going to be as close to the cording as possible. Next thing you'll want to do is adjust your stitch length to a longer stitch length, so around 4 millimeters would be good. All right, so here's what we're going to do for this first round of stitching, right? Because this round of stitching is just basting the piping to the garment. For this round, you're going to just make it your goal to get as close as possible, if not right on top of the stitching that's already on the piping. So I'm going to lower my presser foot here. I'm going to kind of position my needle right on that stitching. It's a little hard to get started on a piece like this, but there I go. Okay, so you can see my needle is as close as I can get it to that stitching. So I'm kind of stitching right on top with my pink stitching where the green stitching is on the piping. Got it? So much stitching. Just take out your pins as you go. And you can see here I clipped my piping flange at the corner here, this pivot point. So you do want to pivot. Like I said, we're going to get some kind of like gentle curves, not like super pointy epaulets if you're using piping. Move that back in a little bit. My point. I'm going to pivot again and just make sure that you don't stitch onto the cord of the piping, just next to it. Again, this is a pivot point at that corner. Now here's the easier side again. And there we go. You don't really need to backstitch on this step. All right, so just trim your threads. You can trim away any excess piping if you have any. All right, so there's what that's going to look like now. The next thing we're going to do is take a second epaulet without piping on it and make sure it's the right side. Put it right sides together with your other piped epaulet, and so the piping will be sandwiched in between the two. And now what I want you to do is work from the side that has your epaulet basting showing, the stitching you just did. Okay, because that's going to be our guide for where to stitch on this next round of stitching when we actually stitch the two pieces together. So again, you can just pin these pieces together. There we go. Okay. Now you're going to switch your stitch length back to 2.5 for just a standard seam.
And now, see this line of stitching I just did? You're going to try as hard as possible to stitch just to the left of that stitching, because that means that your previous line of stitching won't show, the pink, and also the green stitching on the piping won't show. So this is the final round of stitching, and we want to hide any previous stitching. So get started here, and here you're going to want to backstitch. So I'm just keeping an eye on that pink basting we just did on the last step, and I'm positioning my needle so that it's just to the left of that. Now you don't want to be too far left, because then you're going to be stitching on the cording itself. So just barely to the left there, and here's a little pivot point. So you may be noticing that epaulets are not the easiest thing to pipe, so just take it slow. The collar will be much easier once you've practiced on these epaulets, because it's a bigger piece with just a gentle curve, not these little points. Okay, there we go. So if you feel at any point on your stitching that you're not happy with where you stitched, or you didn't get close enough, now's the time to fix it. You can fix it now. You can go back closer. It's kind of like an invisible zipper. If you didn't get close enough to the coil, you can always go back, right? So piping is the same way. If I didn't get close enough, I can always go. I'm a little worried about my point, so I'm probably going to go back to the point and just try to get it a little sharper and a little closer to the cording itself. So I'm just going to redo that. And then the next thing we're going to do is trim down those seam allowances and turn it right side out. So just going to redo this little area here. So that's it. If you can just go back in and redo a little section. You don't even need to really backstitch. Okay. Let's go over to the ironing board. The next thing we're going to do is trim down our seam allowances, and I would just trim like a grade like this. So just hold your scissors kind of at an angle like this to get a nice sort of like natural grade there. And then you can just trim away from the points as close as possible. You really want to reduce any bulk in these corners here. So like that is fine. Okay, now we're going to turn this right side out, which is a little fiddly, as they say. You can get like a nice dull knitting needle or chopstick or something if you're having a hard time, but I think I ended up doing all of these just with my hands. It just takes a minute. You can kind of like push them from the inside too. There it goes. Yeah, okay, so once you've got it mostly turned out, you can go in with a finger and just kind of press it out. Okay, so now you can kind of see what I'm saying, where it's just more of a gentle curve around there. You're not going to get super sharp points when you're sewing epaulets with piping. And it really bothered me when I first did mine, and I was Googling piped epaulets to see how other people did them. And it turns out if you pipe your epaulets, they all end up looking roughly like this. So it's not you. It's just really hard to pipe epaulets, and they end up having more of a curved shape. now would be a good time to get out our press cloth, because I did tell you not to press directly on wool, didn't I? So a nice silk organza press cloth here. And there we go. So you can kind of shape it with steam a little bit, but that's pretty much what you're looking for. Okay, so I'm going to show you now, while we're here, how to place this one epaulette on one of the shoulder seams. And then also my other epaulette. Okay, so the epaulette goes on the outer shoulder seam. So it's going to be facing in like this. Sometimes you'll see them on shirts and stuff like that going out, but it's more common, especially in scouting uniforms, which is our inspiration, to have the epaulette be seamed into the sleeve seam, okay? So this is where the sleeve is going to be set in. And I'm going to center the epaulette, over that shoulder seam and just pin it in place there. And you want to make sure that the seam allowances below stay open, pressed open, right? And now we're just going to take this to the machine and baste it in the seam allowance. Okay, so it's a little bit of a funny point here because the shoulder seam comes to a slight inverted angle. And this is a very straight edge right here, but that's fine. So I'm just going to keep my zipper foot on because I still need it for the next step of doing my other epaulette. But you can just baste this on real quickly by machine. I'm using a nice long stitch length here. There we go. So at the end of the capelet construction, the epaulette will be held down with a button, and there is a mark for where to place the button. So you can refer back to that, but this is how it's going to be attached. So I'm going to go ahead and sew my other epaulette, do the piping and all of that, baste it to the other shoulder, and then we're going to come back and talk about sleeves. Okay, next step is your sleeves. So the sleeves on this capelet aren't really traditional sleeves in the sense that you put your arm through a tube. They're more like a flutter sleeve that doesn't actually encapsulate the arm. Okay, so it just goes all around your body. But that said, this is drafted like a sleeve. So you can see when I hold this up, there is like a cap shape at the top. And there are also the traditional markers or notches that a sleeve would have. So there's a single notch at the top of the cap, which matches the shoulder seam on the body of the capelet. There is a single notch on the front side of the sleeve, just like there is on any sleeve. There's a single notch in the front. And then, you might have guessed this by now, there's a double notch in the back of the sleeve that matches the back of the capelet, just like you would see on a regular sleeve. So the first thing we're going to do is we're really going to set this in just like a regular sleeve because it's curved and it needs to have some ease built into it so that we can then set it into the body of the capelet. So we're going to do 2 rows of basting stitches just like you would for a traditional sleeve cap. So do your first row at about 1/2 inch. You can see I have my underlining stitching, the basting there at about 1/2 inch. So I'm going to go slightly in from that. And I'm going to start at the single notch. And you really want to have your, I always have to remember this myself, just pull those threads to the back so that you have a nice bobbin thread to pull at the end of this. And I'm using a like 4.5 millimeter stitch length. And I'm going to stitch all the way around until I get to the double notch. notch. I'm going to give myself a thread there. And then I'm going to do another row of basting next to my first one. So between the first row of basting and Henry and the raw edge of the fabric, you're going to do another row of just straight basting stitches here. Ending at the double notch. And the next thing I'm going to do is pull those basting stitches, the bobbin threads. You're going to want to pull those stitches up and just build in some shape into this sleeve cap. So you don't want to see any gathers. It's really a very slight shape, but this is what you want to see, is just a little bit of ruffling around the edge there, but nice and smooth at the actual seam line. So this is going to take a few minutes. So you're going to do this from one side until you've kind of moved all that ease, and you get to the single notch, which is the center or the shoulder seam. So now I'm going to go from the other side, pulling those basting stitches up. So just grab the bobbin threads and do the same thing, just build in some shape into the sleeve cap. And there we go. So you're looking for this to start to form a cap shape like a sleeve. All right, and once you're happy with the shape that it's taken, and it, like I said, it really doesn't need a whole lot of ease, just this is very subtle amount of ease because of the shape this capelet has. Once you're happy with how it looks, then you can pin this to the capelet itself. So you're going to put it right sides together and make sure you're working with the correct side. So I have a single notch here, matching a single notch on the capelet. Double notch matches the double notch in the back. I always like to find my single notch, which matches the shoulder seam first. Match that first. And the epaulette will be sandwiched in between there, so you're gonna have a bit of bulk right there. And next you can match the double notch and see if you need to distribute the ease. It looks like I have a little too much ease, so I need to kind of relax it a little bit by scrunching those stitches back out. There we go. And pin down to the hem. Same thing on the other side. Match your single notch there, and then just see. Okay, that looks good. Okay, and now that this is, pinned into the capelet, now we're going to sew it. Okay, so make sure you're back on a regular stitch length, 2.5 millimeters, stitching at 5/8 of an inch. And just stitch from one hem of the sleeve to the other. Okay, so I finished sewing my sleeve seam. I'm just kind of checking it from the outside, making sure there's no puckers or anything, and it looks good. So now you're going to press this seam open. You're going to place the hem under the sleeve. And you might need to do some clipping and notching here, and you'll see what I mean once we start to get around the curved area. Okay, so this is a great example. So see how it's kind of like a princess seam. I know we've done princess seams together before. So on the straighter side of a princess seam, it kind of strains a little bit when you press it open, and you need to clip it just about every ½ inch, like around there. And then you'll be able to press it open nicely. You'll also see some ruffling on the opposite side, the more curved side. So what you can do there is do a few little notches, because it's an outer curve, right? Sorry, this is really hard to do from this angle. But you get the idea, a few little notches like that to remove some of that ruffly excess. So just like a princess seam. Oops. So just keep pressing around the sleeve seam, notching and clipping as needed. And then you're going to follow all those steps for the other sleeve, and then we'll be ready to sew our collars. Okay, time to sew our collar. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the collar pieces. You have two of them. They're different pattern pieces though. There's an over collar, or what is it? Upper collar, I think is what we call it in the pattern pieces, upper collar. And that should be slightly bigger than the under collar. Okay, so whenever possible, we try to draft things that way so that the seam on the edge of the collar kind of wraps to the underside. Okay, so the upper collar should be interfaced. All right, so I've done my weft fusible interfacing there, but the under collar is not. I am piping my collar, so it's the same method as we did for the epaulets. So I went ahead and basted the piping to the upper collar. I like to pipe it to the side that has a little bit more stability, so the side with the interfacing. So you'll see I did need to do some little clips around these corners. This is an interesting collar shape because it's not really a shirt style collar with a really severe corner, and it's also not a Peter Pan collar. It's kind of like a mix. It's a hybrid. So you're just going to do a soft curve around that outer edge of the collar. Okay, so after you've basted your piping to the upper collar, then you're going to sew these pieces right sides together, again, just like we did for the epaulets, sandwiching the piping in between the two. And again, you're going to want to pin from the side with your stitching from when you stitched the piping on, so that when we go to stitch these pieces together, you can stitch right inside that line of stitching to make sure that no stitching shows. Okay, so I'm going to pin and then stitch around these outer edges, and this inner edge with the two notches, this stays open, also stays unpiped too, because this is the neckline edge. So piping and stitching is just around these outer edges here. All right, so I'm going to pin and then we'll go over to the machine and stitch this. Okay, we are ready to sew the collar. So I did want to mention another thing about putting the under collar and the upper collar together. I did tell you that the upper collar is going to be slightly bigger around the outer edges than the under collar. So to take that a step further, what that means is you need to really make sure to match these outer edges, okay? And the pieces themselves won't exactly match, but that's what's intended by the drafting. So make sure you really manipulate those outer edges here so that they do match, okay? Does that make sense? So you have to really make those pieces match because the outside is drafted just a little bit bigger on the upper collar than the under collar. Okay, so because I have piping on my collar, I am using a zipper foot again and my regular stitch length and stitching just inside the basting line from where I basted on the piping. If you are not using piping, then you're just going to be sewing around these two collar pieces together at 5/8 of an inch. Using a regular stitch length, no zipper foot, obviously. Okay, so after you've stitched all the way around, especially if you've done piping, it's easy to kind of turn the collar right side out at this point and make sure that you're happy with how your piping looks, that you stitched close enough to the cording. I've tended to find on this collar that there are a couple areas where I want to fix, and I do see one right here on this outer corner. So like I said, it's just like an invisible zipper. You can go back and stitch just a little bit closer to get a little bit closer to your cording, which will give the piping a neater and more consistent look all the way around. So just go fix any little areas you're not quite happy with where you want to stitch a little closer. And so yeah, just stitch in that area, then check again, make sure you're happy. All right, I can deal with that. Okay, so the next thing you're going to do, and maybe you can guess because at this point we've done a few collars for Patreon, we are going to grade the seam allowances and we're going to notch the outer curves and then understitch. So the shorter seam allowance will be the one that isn't interfaced, or the under collar. So I'm just going to trim that down to about a 1/4 inch is fine. Okay, and then the upper collar, the one with the interfacing on it, can be trimmed a little bit taller, about 1/8 of an inch taller than the first one. So we're getting sort of like a beveled effect here through grading. So we won't get a ridge when we turn our collar right side out. So finally, you are going to do some little notches around this curve on each side. Do a few little notches like that. So you want just some little triangles taken out. Just around the curved points is fine. That's going to help your curve lay really smoothly. There we go, maybe one more over here. Okay, got a lot of little confetti pieces now. Okay, so before we can press the collar, the final thing I want you to do is understitch the collar. Now, to do that, you're going to open out the collar like this, and we're going to understitch just along this long outer edge. You can't really understitch into these corners, and it's really hard to get on the short ends too. So you're just going to open out the collar And I'm going to use my zipper foot again because I have piping. If you didn't use piping, you could just use a regular presser foot. But using the zipper foot will let me get nice and close to the seam. Okay, so I'm kind of maneuvering the piece, like holding it open like this. And then here you have a good view from this machine camera. I'm gonna get nice and close to this seam. I'll put my needle down right now so you can see what I'm talking about. So my needle is going to be about 1/8 of an inch away from this seam line, from where my piping is. And I'm going to be catching the seam allowances in my stitching underneath here. So you want to make sure that your seam allowances are positioned to the right so that they're under your needle and caught in your stitching. Okay, so I'm going to start stitching. Back stitch here. And understitching a collar always helps you get a really nice crisp edge when you press it. So just to be really clear, I'm stitching on the under collar side, so the side without interfacing. So we don't want this to show. Okay, and now we're getting to the opposite corner here where you kind of have to maneuver between all the layers. I'm gonna back stitch. Just go as far as you can and then back stitch. Trim those threads. And make sure my iron is on. And now you're going to, I'm going to press it from the wrong side. You probably want a lint roller handy if you've got little piping confetti like I do. So from the underside, I guess would be the right way to say this. Now the piping makes it a little easier to press this seam. If you don't have piping, then you're going to need to really roll the seam line out to the edge. Excuse my little green triangles everywhere. So I'm going to grab a lint roller. And then the next thing I'm going to do is just baste these raw edges together, okay? So that the layers of the collar can't open up like this anymore. So just put your machine at a long basting stitch and just baste right across there at 1/2 inch. And then we're going to place the collar onto the capelet. I've gone ahead and done my basting on my collar, so you can see just a line of basting right here so that the inner edge doesn't flop open at all. And now we're going to baste the collar to the capelet. So you can just kind of lay your capelet out flat, and there are 2 notches on the inside neckline of your collar, and those match the shoulder seams on the capelet. So you can start matching there. But actually, there's another set of notches, one that matches this little notch right here too. So that should get you your exact collar placement here, and then another notch here where the collar ends. So there you go. So it should fit in pretty easily. Doesn't need to be eased or anything like that. Those 2 edges fit together pretty nicely. So your collar's pinned on. Now we're going to baste it on. So still using a basting stitch, it will get sewn for real when we put the lining and facing unit together with the outer capelet. So at about 1/2 inch, I'm just going to baste all these layers together. As you'll see, it does start to get pretty thick around the neckline because we have the collar layers, underlining, outer capelet, and then we're going to add the facing layer as well. So we're going to be doing some trimming later. Okay, so my collar is basted on. So your outer capelet is pretty much done at this point, except for some finishing stuff at the end. So obviously these are gonna get, you know, buttoned down and everything. So the next thing we're going to do is go work on the facing and lining unit. So let's head over to the table and talk about that. Okay, so the next steps are going to be to put together the facing unit. So you're gonna need your back neckline facing and make sure you have your interfacing applied and your 2 front facing pieces, again, with the interfacing applied. So what you're gonna do is put these right sides together at the shoulder, which is this little straight line right there, and make sure that the neckline is going in, just like the capelet. I'm gonna pin these together at the shoulder seams. And the next thing I'm gonna do is just sew at 5/8 of an inch right along here and here where I've pinned, and then press those open. So that's an easy step. I don't think you need to see that. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that, and then we'll be back and we're gonna start working on putting the lining together. And we're ready to move on to our lining construction. So there are a few things I want to go over with you. There are 3 main pieces for the lining. There's your back lining piece, a front lining piece, and then the sleeve pattern piece, which is the same as the outer piece you cut. You're just going to cut it again in your lining fabric. So the first thing we need to do is sew the back pleats, center back on the back lining pattern piece. If you have made any of my outerwear patterns before, like the swing coat or the princess coat, then this will be very familiar to you. We always put a pleat in the back lining just to allow some extra movement in the lining so it doesn't pull on your outer garment. It's just very standard in jackets and coats. So we wanted to include it in our capelet as well. So you want to transfer. So what I have here is my back pattern piece, back lining pattern piece, which is cut on the fold in my charmeuse, and then I've gone ahead and pinned it down the center back line, and I transferred my pleat lines to the fabric. I just used one of these disappearing ink pens. The disappearing ink showed up pretty well on the green charmeuse. Hopefully you can see it. So you need to have that line marked in there. I always put a notch at my pleat line as well too. So what we're going to do first is go over to the machine and stitch along those lines till the end point, back stitch. Same at the top and bottom. Press the pleat to one side and then stay stitch around the back lining neckline. So let's head to the machine. You're ready to sew your pleats on your lining now. So just as you marked them, just place them in the machine. I'm starting on the bottom here. And just use your regular stitch length, 2.5. And you want to back stitch. Worth mentioning, I did change to a thread color to match my lining at this point, so you probably want to do the same. You might also need to change your needle. If you have a very thin silk, but then you're using a bigger needle for your capelet because you have like a more sturdy outerwear fabric for your capelet, then you'll probably need to change needles at this point. If you notice it, like the needle kind of like punching into your fabric and not really creating nice little stitches, then it might be time to change the old needle. Okay, now I'm going to the top. So backstitch at each end of the pleat. There we go, trim your threads. Okay, so now you can take all of these pins out here. And what you're going to do is open out the piece like this. So you have two knife pleats is what these technically are called, because they're folded together and then they get pressed to one side. Now it doesn't really matter what side you press it to. So just pick a side, whichever side, and press it that way. And also worth noting, you might need to change the heat setting on your iron if you're using a delicate silk. Okay, now we're going to press the bottom pleat. Now this is important, you need to press it in the same direction as the top pleat. Press it that way. Okay, you don't have to press the whole pleat down. I just press it like where I've stitched it and then pin it in place. Now what we're going to do is you need to base the pleats in place. I'm going to start with the bottom one, the one on the hem. Switch to a longer stitch length and use 1/2 inch seam allowance. And you just need to baste it enough so that it's holding the pleat down. Okay, so just there. Now the neckline is going to be a little different because you need to do some stay stitching around the back neckline so that you can clip it at the next, well, one of the next stages in the process when we go to sew the lining to the facing. You're going to need to clip that back neckline. So I like to stay stitch before I clip anything. So here what I would recommend is stitching around the entire neckline. So start at one shoulder. You don't really need to back stitch. I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance for the entire thing. There's my pleat. And just keep going and be really careful here not to stretch this out as you're stitching. Go to the other end. So now I'm at the opposite shoulder. And now I have stay stitched the entire back neckline while simultaneously holding that pleat in place. Okay, so now we need to continue with constructing the rest of the lining. So I have my back lining piece. I'm going to find my two front lining pieces. There's my sleeves. There's my front lining pieces. I'm going to sew the shoulder seams next. So this is just like how we did the outer capelet. So I think you guys have probably got this, but I'll just kind of take you through it quickly as I'm sewing. So each shoulder seam, you're going to pin. This is just like step one, remember, that we did earlier. Each shoulder seam is going to get pinned together. And then sewn and pressed open. now we can press these open. I'm going to use my seam roll again. Okay, shoulder seams are sewn. The next step is to sew in the sleeves into the lining, and it's exactly the same as how you did your outer sleeves. So I'm gonna let you go ahead and do that on your own. I will say, if you found the double easing method, the row of double, let me try this one more time. The double row of easing stitches around the sleeve cap, if you found that to be overkill because there's not a lot of easing that happens on this sleeve, another thing that you can try is the crowding method, and I'll show you real quick what I mean. I've talked about this before in Princess Jacket video and in my books, so you may be familiar with it, but it requires just doing one single row of easing stitches. So set your stitch length to around 4. You're still at 1/2 inch. And what you're going to do is just take your left index finger and just place it behind the presser foot here. And you're going to start, oops, I'm at 5/8. Here we go. You're going to start stitching and let the fabric just crowd up behind the presser foot. And I've also heard this called crimping, because what it does is creates a little crimp in the fabric. So if I start to release some, you'll see what I'm talking about. See how it's just slightly crimped? So that's just a slight bit of easing, which should be enough. So you can just release it a couple times as you're sewing when it starts to build up too much behind the presser foot. Okay, so now you have just like a slightly eased seam allowance, which will be a little more subtle of an effect when you go to set it into the capelet lining. So just another option that you can try when you're setting in your flutter sleeves. Okay, so finish those steps, and then the next thing we're going to talk about is sewing the facing unit to the lining unit. Okay, everyone, so your capelet lining is all sewn. You've got the sleeves in. One thing I did want to mention is that we haven't talked about yet is that these flutter sleeves are on the bias. So the grain is going diagonally across this way, which means they're stretchy across there, and then they have a lot of drape. So this is a great cut for anything that fluttery, that's meant to have a lot of movement to it. So that's why we chose to have the sleeves cut on the bias. We also thought it would be nice if you ever made this in plaid. It would be really cool to have the plaid going on the bias rather than going in a straight line all the way around the body. So that's why we did that way. But it may mean that you notice that your seams don't match up. If your bias has stretched at all, like you have a really like fluid drapey lining fabric, you might notice that these seams don't match up here, and it's probably just because of the bias stretching. So you might need to trim that up. So just a word of advice. Okay, so next thing we're going to do is you're going to look at your neckline. So this is the back neckline where we stay stitched, and I've gone ahead and done some clips around that back neckline, and that's going to come in handy in this next step, which you'll see. We need to sew the lining to the facing unit. So these two, this is going to form a seam right here. So obviously this is going to go right sides together, excuse me, right sides together. And the pleat is going to match up to this center back notch. So what you can see is these are now opposing curves. So it's really going to help to have those notches in here. And actually, I would recommend working the other way, to be honest. It's a little easier to now match up your shoulder seams and then see how these clips will like spread to match that curve. That's what you want. So now you can pin them together and sew them quite easily. Okay, same thing on the other side. Just spread the clips out. You might need to make a few more clips if it's not really working yet. If you're seeing it like that it's quite tight. Okay, so that's the back neckline. And then with the front facing to the front lining, there's one notch that you need to match here. And then this curved area, this is a slightly opposing curve as well, but nowhere near as dramatic as the back neckline. So you should just be able to manipulate the pieces and pin them in place. And then down to the hem area. So just continue to fill in with pins, and we're going to be stitching from one hem around the back neckline down to the other hem. So I'm just going to keep pinning this, and then we'll sew this seam at the machine.
Okay, we're ready to sew the lining to the facing that we just pinned. Okay, so you're gonna start, like I said, at one hem and just sew from one hem to the other. So you now have a completed facing lining unit. So you can press this seam. I personally feel like it looks nicer if you just leave it and just kind of position the seam allowances towards the lining, though they're really going to go that way naturally just because the facing is a lot heavier than the lining fabric, so they'll just kind of naturally face that way. So you really don't need to do anything here, though. If you really want to press it, you certainly can, but I do think it looks a little bit nicer just kind of soft like that. Okay, so big news. It's now time to sew our lining slash facing unit together with our outer capelet. Okay, so now would be a good time actually to switch back to your main thread color. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. But first I want to show you how to put the two pieces together and pin them. So you've got this big outer capelet unit. And then a big lining slash facing unit. You're going to put them together. So right sides together, and pin them all the way around the entire outer circumference as well as the neckline. So you can see where I'm starting. It's the neckline area. So you're going to have the collar sandwiched in between the facing and the capelet. So you're going to have a really thick seam right here. This is where you're going to need a heavier, bigger needle than what you were using for, say, your silk charmeuse. It's a totally different weight.
This is the front corner at the front neckline. And then you just keep pinning down the front edge of the capelet, pinning just the facing and the capelet together. So remember, I have that underlined outer fabric and then my interfaced facing. And then you're going to pin together the entire hem. And this is where you're going to realize how big this hem is. You think it's a tiny little capelet, and then it really has quite a big circumference to it. So you're going to pin all the way around here. Now you do need to leave an opening, and I would suggest, my hair is stuck in here, I would suggest like 6 to 7 inches, like a nice chunk that you leave open, because this whole thing is going to be bagged. I don't know if you've ever heard that term before, but a bagged lining means you sew around the entire outside of the garment, leave an opening, and then turn the whole thing right side out. So the garment is lined to the edges, and you just have one opening that you then need to close. And is a perfect method for something like a capelet where you don't have actual sleeves that are gonna get in your way of doing this. So this is a really easy peasy way to line a garment. And you just have to remember to leave that opening for yourself. So this is the sleeve that I'm pinning right now. And you can see they've got a lot of length around that lower edge. Here's my center back, and you can tell that's my center back because of the pleat. And now this is around where I would recommend leaving that opening. And my piece of advice is to always give yourself like a double pin like this, where you need to start and stop stitching. So I'm doing the same over here. I'm out of pins though, guys. I need more pins. So I'm going to do another double pin right here. Leave this opening. I'm going to keep pinning. I'm going to find some more pins. I'm going to keep pinning all the way around here. And then I'm going to sew all the way around at 5/8 of an inch. So I'm going to leave you to do that. Really simple, sewing around, pivoting at any corners, and leaving that 6-inch opening. And then we'll come back and talk about how to treat those seams. And you may guess that involves grading and some clipping and some trimming. All right, so I'll see you in a little bit. All right, so you can see that I have sewn around my neckline, my fronts right here, and then all the way around this hem. All right, so the next thing to do is to grade / trim your seam allowances. So you can start at the neckline. You have a lot of layers here, like we were just talking about. So I would recommend doing your facing seam allowance first and trimming it down nice and short, like a little less than 1/4 inch. And then your collar will be next. There are a couple layers in the collar, so I just kind of hold my scissors at an angle so it gives it sort of like a natural grade. And then the capelet itself. Okay, so you're going to go around the neckline in that way. You're also going to do the same thing at the front, the hem all the way around, and you're going to clip away from any corners. So like that, you're going to make sure you have as little bulk as possible in those corners. And you're also going to need to do some clipping. So around the neckline, make sure you have nice sharp scissors for this. About every 1/2 inch, you're going to clip like that. There we go. Okay, so I'm just gonna keep going around like that. Now, as for these slight outer curves on the sleeves, if you could trim your seam allowances close enough, you don't need to do any notching or clipping there. So when you get down here, just trim your seam allowance on the lining down real short, and then the capelet seam allowance just a little bit taller than that, so that you don't have a lot of bulk in there that's going to ripple up. Okay, so I'm just gonna keep going with my grading and clipping. And then the next thing to do will be to turn the whole thing right side out through that opening we left. And then a little bit of understitching, and then really just like pressing and finishing. So we're almost there. Okay, so you've done all of your grading, clipping, trimming, etc. And now we're going to turn the capelet right side out through the opening that you left in at the back hem. So just turn it all right side out. And the next thing we're going to do is a little bit of understitching. So the one thing about bagging a lining like this is it does make it kind of difficult to get to some of the edges to understitch. So like normally we might understitch like around the neckline. We're not really going to do that. But I do think it's important to, and you know, you just want to trim away any threads you have there. I do think it's important to understitch this front opening right here to get a really nice crisp edge. So what you're going to do, where's my opening? Here it is. You're going to really just push those corners out as much as you can. You can use a point presser or something like that. Push those corners out. And now we're going to understitch by going through this hole. So it's a little awkward. And you'll like I am right now, kind of lose track of where you are. But what you need to do is find that hole and then put it over the free arm of your machine so that you kind of get it onto the free arm like this, like you're sewing a sleeve or something like that. And then you'll be able to at least understitch most of that front edge. So we're going to get in here and we're understitching the facing. So just real quickly, make sure your seam allowances are underneath where you're going to be stitching. And we're stitching on the facing, whoops, bumped the camera. We're stitching on the facing just about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam. And just go as far as you can. You're not going to be able to get all the way up into the corner. And then back stitch. So you're going to have a lot of threads to trim. And now we're going to have to get out the hole again. And obviously I'm going to do the other side of the front opening, but you'll see now that this will be able to press much flatter. Ugh, so many little threads here. Okay. All right. So make sure that your little corners are pulled out as far as they can go. And then you're going to press from the inside and just roll the edges out. Okay, so you're going to do that at the front openings. Obviously, I'm going to understitch the other opening, which you didn't see me do. And then you're going to go around the entire hem And you're going to need to roll the lining so that it's just sort of rolled to the inside of the garment like this. And then you can give it a little steam, a little press. And really spend some time pressing the edge of the capelet because that's what's going to give it a nice look from the outside. So I am going to go around the entire lining edge like that, rolling it out, but making sure that you're not going to see the green from the outside. So you want to just kind of like push it towards the edge, but you want to see a little bit of pink or whatever color your capelet is at the outside edge. Okay, so you're going to do that. A lot of pressing to do. One more thing I wanted to mention is that it can be really handy to secure all the layers at the inner shoulder here by stitching in the ditch. So that will kind of keep all the layers nice and flat together. So what you can do is lift up the collar and then put a pin through that seam. And then you want it to match as much as possible the seam on the facing, the shoulder seam on the facing. And then put that in the machine. It's going to be quite thick, so you're going to have to just maneuver it. Now I have to take my pin out, of course. Maneuver it underneath the presser foot. And stitch in the ditch, which means to, and I just realized I have my light on, so let me turn that off because that will actually help you see a little bit better right here. Stitch right in the seam line. Just to the edge of the facing right there is fine. You can feel the edge of the facing underneath there. And then pull that out, trim those threads. And that will give you a much sort of flatter, smoother finish at the neckline right there. So you'll really be able to feel the difference once you do that. Okay, so we have a lot of pressing to do. I have my understitching to do on my other side, a lot of pressing, and you'll have your opening at the lower back. So just turn in those seam allowances there and pin it. We're gonna be hand stitching that, okay? So do all of that stuff, really press it, spend some time with pressing, and then we're gonna come back and the final thing we're gonna talk about is sewing on buttons, that final little bit of hand stitching, and just your final finishing steps. So we're almost there. Okay, so we're finally here. We're almost done. So I just wanted to mention a few things and just talk you through finishing. I'm not gonna make you watch me hand sew on buttons or anything like that, but I do want to take you through the final steps. So one thing I want to mention is just the more time you can spend with steaming and pressing this garment, I feel like the happier you're going to be with it. So one thing you can do is like put your little hammy in the neckline and kind of like wrap it around like that's a little person, right? And like really steam it on there so you get the shape. I would also recommend spending some time really pressing like these corners, put a press cloth on there, press it nice and flat. And the lower edge, really important to have a nice crisp edge there. So spend some time there. And like we talked about, you know, you definitely want to be like rolling in the lining around that outer edge on the inside. Okay, so I want you all to spend time pressing. And then let's just talk about the final hand stuff. So there's that opening in the lining that I have just like pinned shut now, just turned in and pressed the edges. And then you're just gonna do a little slip stitch along there, just a little hidden invisible slip stitch at the bottom to close that. And then you're gonna have some buttons and snaps to sew on. So let's talk about the epaulets first. You are going to take one of your buttons, and there is a button mark on the shoulder seam, by the way, but I'm kind of naughty and I don't check the mark. So I will tell you that what you can do is you just want to build in a little bit of room. You don't want to like pull the epaulette that way so that it's really tight. You want to actually build in a little bit of ease in the epaulette so it stands up just slightly. And then you're going to hand sew on the button so that it goes through all the layers right there. Okay, so one button on each epaulette. And then you're going to do the neckline closure. So cross the right side over the left. And like we were talking about in the intro, it's really hard to make a buttonhole by machine right here. So what I would recommend doing is doing one of these little fabric color covered snaps, or just, you know, a metal snap is fine. Sewing one side to the inside, to the underlap side, and then the other side to the overlap side. And then if you want to have a decorative button on the outside, then you hand sew that button right there. So that's sort of the easy way to do it. And you kind of get the best of both worlds. You get that decorative button and you don't have to wrestle with your machine buttonhole in that really thick space. Another alternative, of course, would be to do a bound buttonhole, but you would have had to make it at the very beginning. So if you want to do that next time, do that. Okay, everyone, so that's your finished Charm Scout capelet. I hope you love this project. I was just thinking that there's so much that you could do with this. I feel like it's ripe for cosplay and all sorts of fun stuff. It looks great just for a fall or winter outfit, you know, paired with a pencil skirt, done in plaid. I can't wait to see some plaid versions out there. You'll have seen my fur trimmed version now, very Beauty and the Beast inspired. So have fun. I hope that you really, and I also hope you take advantage of the way that this is interchangeable with the hooded princess coat expansion. So I really want to see some of you add this to a full princess coat. I think that would be so beautiful. There are a lot of Lily Ann vintage coats that have a removable capelet and even a removable hood. So there's a lot you can do with this. I hope you really like it. Overall, I am just so delighted and excited about Camp Gertie and the Charm Scouts. So I can't wait to see what other projects we can come up with this year in the scouting theme. So stay tuned for more, and I will see you next time, Charm Scouts.